Okay, welcome everyone to Palmistry 101 with the School of Occult Arts. I am Kat Eckhart and I will be your lecturer for this evening's first class on palmistry. Now, I've done palmistry and I've studied it and I've read palms for a few years now. So I had the fortune of being able to do this before COVID hit, before social distancing, and it became more complicated. But thankfully, I was able to look at quite a few palms while I was reading about it and studying it. So I'm going to bring as much as I can to this lecture. This lecture is going to focus on the basics and everything that you would need in order to read palms. So after this lecture is complete, you should be able to more or less read palms. Now, I know that a lot of this information is available on the internet, and a lot of it is actually accurate. That's not always true when it comes to esoteric or occult subjects, but palmistry has been around for so long, and for whatever reason, there is a lot of good information. There's a lot of pictures that you can look up to see what exactly does this look like, what is it supposed to look like, and I've used these resources myself. So tonight I really wanted to focus on teaching. I wanted to focus on getting a good understanding of what palmistry is and how to read it. What do mounts mean? What do lines actually indicate on the palm? So hopefully we are going to come away with a really good understanding of palmistry. So tonight we are going to do a brief intro, very brief origins, the value of it and what makes it unique from other divination forms. We're going to talk about the basics, quadrants on the hand, shape and finger types. We're going to talk about mounts and major lines. And then we're going to talk about more advanced topics in palmistry, such as the minor lines, the markings on the hands, the quadrangle and fingerprints. And we're just going to touch on this pretty briefly because generally when you're doing a short read, you really only focus on the basics and you'll point out anything that strikes you from the more advanced topics. And then we're going to go over some palmistry guidelines, which will really help you know how to read efficiently and confidently. And then we're going to go through a brief reading procedure, the order, what you should say, how you can make it a really good reading that empowers the individual. So, palmistry or chiromancy is a system of divination by interpreting lines, mounts, and many other qualities of the hands, which was born out of the Eastern world, but eventually influenced by the Western. And when I say eventually, it was probably thousands of years after its inception. The origins are probably around India, but it was used and developed in China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and the list goes on. You will see the Greek influence in this lecture. You'll see it online too a lot because many of the fingers, you can even see in this picture here on the slide, are associated with planets and specifically Greek gods. So that's an interesting correspondence. Palmistry is probably one of the oldest forms of fortune telling, probably the oldest system apart from astrology, which it grew out of. It's been used as both a tool for understanding the true nature of the person, not only yourself, but others, and also as a form of divination. It was interesting. There's a story that Caesar used palmistry in order to judge his men to see if they were trustworthy or not. Unfortunately, maybe he didn't use it on all of his men. And its palmistry and fingerprints have been used as a form of identification. It's said that in 3000 BC, Chinese emperor used his thumbprint or his fingerprint in order to sign things, really authorize things. A more modern writer on palmistry, Cairo, which I actually have his book here, Cairo's Palmistry for All. He said that the hands were viewed as the immediate instruments of the brain. So it was kind of like a view of what's going on in your brain right on your hand. Palmistry has developed over thousands of years, and we have the advantage of having a lot of the information and writings of some new researchers and thinkers in the world of palmistry. In the 19th and 20th century, palmistry was studied with more of a scientific bent. It was taken a little bit out of the world of the esoteric by many writers on palmistry and kind of viewed as a way of determining health, a way of figuring out people's habits and looking at it in a more kind of scientific lens. Not that palmistry hasn't always been used as a way of learning about someone's health, because that's always been an important indicator when looking at palmistry. So what is its value? Palmistry is really, really well loved by people. Whenever I go anywhere and I'm prepared to do palmistry or divination or runes of any type, people are almost 9.5 times out of 10 choose palmistry. They get really, really excited that someone's offering it. I think maybe the culture has sort of gotten to a point where they see palmistry as a really interesting and mostly non-threatening thing. So people love hearing about themselves and having someone like sit down and actually read what the lines on their hands mean. It's a cool way to know more about yourself, and it's more accessible. So a lot of people really love it. Palmistry can identify hidden talents and aptitude, and even provide career advice. So there's a great author, Richard Webster. I know some of us here already know that name. He wrote a book called Potential in the Palm of Your Hand, I think. And he talks all about how he can read the lines and the mounts and everything on your hand to sort of give people guidance on what they may have overlooked as far as their talents and their natural gifts. So that's one advantage and value of palmistry. You can also give people a quick reading or go really, really in depth. So it really is flexible in that way. You can do a 5-minute reading that can be pretty meaningful for people depending on what you say. Or you could have prints done of their hands. You could really sit down and look at all the minor lines, read fingerprints, read finger placement, finger set. It could be as in depth as you want it to be. So it's very flexible in that way. This is different from other divination systems in that palmistry is pretty darn exact and it's less intuitive. Where the intuition comes in is what you say and how you say it to people. But palmistry is one of those things where you kind of have to carefully research and read and literally look up people's lines and even touch the mounts on their hands. And we'll get into that. But it's almost, you have to have like kind of a researcher mindset in a way when you're approaching people's hands, because you want to read these really small details in a way that, unlike tarot, where you kind of can do it more on intuition, you can kind of get impressions and move from there. It's really about paying close attention when it comes to palmistry. but you can use your intuition in how you say what you're seeing. And we'll get into that later too. Finally, palmistry works with polarities. It works with astrology elements. You can see runes on your hands. You can see so many different things on your hands. So it's a really interesting system that incorporates a lot within it. Part of that's because it's so old. Part of that's because it has been influenced by so many different cultures and astrology. But we'll see that there are a lot of places that you can go when you read palms. Okay. Palmistry basics, your first look. So what are you going to do when people first hold out their hands to you? Well, it's so funny because when you tell people that you're a palmist or you read palms, they'll just throw their hands in your face and they're like, read this, get started. And so you kind of have to take a moment and really reflect on how you're going to explain what it is you're about to do and what you're going to say. And the first thing that I generally talk about when I'm reading palms for others, something that they find a bit unexpected, is what is the difference between major versus minor hands, dominant versus non-dominant? Are you right-handed or left-handed? And we don't sort of talk about, palmists don't talk about whether the difference between being right-handed and left-handed. What we talk about is non-dominant or dominant major versus minor hands. So the major hand, the dominant hand, is said to be what you are doing. And the minor hand is what you're thinking about. I'm going to say that again because it's a bit confusing. Major is what you're doing, minor is what you're thinking about. So if there's a big difference and you're seeing that the heart line and the headline are ending in different places, and some of them, one of them is curved on the major hand and on the minor hand, it's more straight, you're going to say, okay, you might be doing something every day. Maybe it's in your career, but you're thinking about something different. And maybe this means it's a good time to make a change in your life. Or maybe it just means that you have something that you do a lot, but your kind of mind is in a different place. Your thoughts, your subconscious almost is in a different place. The next thing that you can read once you sort of focus in on one hand is the texture of someone's hand. So what does that mean? The polarity here is coarse versus fine texture, and it sort of measures a person's sensitivity. And you read that by examining the back of someone's hand. So you're actually going to look at the back and you're going to try to tell how big the pores are. The bigger they are, the more coarse they say the texture of your skin is. And the smaller they are, the more fine. You'll find a lot of women have very fine texture. So it's said that coarse hands indicate someone who's generally healthy, who's energetic, who is resilient, down to earth, and direct. On the other hand, fine texture is someone who is emotional, sensitive, refined, and possibly prone to bouts of illness. This last little bit is rare that I'll ever share that with anyone, but you should probably know that as a palmist. The next thing you can read is the consistency. So we're actually going to look at the mounts on the hand. We're going to start looking at the sort of fleshy parts of the hand. But instead of drilling down into each one, we're going to look at it overall. See, we're taking the first look still. So overall, is it pretty fluffy or is it more flat? We're going to kind of look at, is it soft or is it firm? That's the polarity here. And what we're measuring by this is a person's motivation. You're going to see soft hands and firm hands. The firm hands are said to indicate someone who is disciplined, who's motivated and challenge-seeking, while the overall soft hands are more pleasure-seeking and comfort-seeking. And you want to read this by gently pressing on the palm to see how soft or hard it is. You can also take an overall impression and just look at the palm. And you will get a good feel for this after you've read a few palms. And you only want to kind of remark about it if the findings are consistent for the whole palm, because you are going to read individual amounts later, and you'll be able to talk about that as you're doing the reading later. We have a chat. Everyone is smooshing their hands right now. Yes. Yes, and you can read along on your own palms right now as well. The next thing you can look at is the quadrants. And I'm throwing this in to the lecture because it is a part of palmistry. I have not found it terribly useful when it comes to actually reading the palms, but this is one of those things that you can take a look at the different quadrants and see if something is going to strike you. And you can either kind of put that in your pocket for later as you're reading the major lines and the mounts, or you can just move on. So there are 4 major quadrants. Quadrant is 4 on the palm. So the top part of the palm is said to indicate the more active section, where the bottom part is said to indicate the more passive areas. And we're going to find that more consistent as we're reading the mounts later, because the bottom, you've got the moon or the mount of Luna, which is all about intuition and more subconscious, instinctual type of things. Sometimes the top is called conscious and the bottom is associated with subconscious, but I prefer active versus passive because I've found that more often. Now that's only 2 parts, top and bottom. So we want to talk about the outer versus inner parts as well. So the outer area is the area with the thumb and the index side. And the inner area is the ring and the little finger, and the outer area, inner area of the palm. Not sure why exactly it's called that. So why do we even look at this? Well, mounts indicate energy. The higher your mount is, then that's kind of the potential you have in that given area. The firmness of that mount indicates how that potential is being used, whether or not it's being used. We'll go over this again, but when you're looking at the quadrants, you can kind of see, oh, is there a very high mount here on the Mount of Venus in this quadrant? And what does exactly that mean? That means that person has a lot of energy, stamina, passion, but it also has to do with the unconscious. It also has to do with the more passive areas. So just going over the quadrants. The thumb and index side is the active outer. It has to do with desire and achievement, actions, and leadership. The ring and the little finger is active inner, has to do with arts, social, higher thinking. The Mount of Venus area, which is just below the thumb and getting into the unconscious passive area, has to do with energy, stamina, sex and passion, unconscious instinct. And the passive inner, the area with the lunar mount, is all to do with intuition, imagination, and emotions. This is probably best represented visually. Puppy second round. Jen, we're actually going to talk about that specifically later. So anyway, The next portion you would read is flexibility. Before you get into the major hand types, you would read how flexible is this person's hand? And this is where you get to communicate with others, because you don't want to test this without asking them first. I once had a person come to me for a reading, and they held out both their hands, and I was getting ready to read the flexibility portion. And their hands looked totally normal, totally fine. I was like, oh, would you mind if I just press down lightly on your thumb? And they said, absolutely not. I was actually just in a car accident and my hand was damaged. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I asked, because it looked totally normal. So always ask. I probably don't need to tell you that, but always ask permission before you press or touch, anything like that. So the polarity that you're looking for when you're looking at a person's flexibility in their hand is it more rigid or is it more bendable? And it's talking to do with receptivity, often about how open are you to different ideas? How flexible are you? How open are you to different experiences? So you can test that by gently trying to bend back, fingers and thumb very much like this, just very gentle. And you can do that if you ask. And you can see once you start to do palm reading, some people's thumbs will just go all the way down and you'll think, where are your bones? And then others will just be like, as if they were resisting you almost. And so you'll find that that's more rigid. People whose fingers are not very flexible are said to be unyielding, sticking to their opinions, more stubborn even. Whereas people who are flexible might be more capable of changing opinions or yielding more quickly, and often can be very idealistic. I am a resistor. Oh gosh. That means you're unyielding and you stick to your opinions. Okay, so now we are going to get into our major hand types. People really generally like this portion of the reading because they like this the most because they've heard sort of that there are different hand types and it has to do with elements, and we're getting into things that they can kind of understand more than flexibility and texture and things like that. So we've got a few things here on the slide. We have what are the basic polarities? And the basics are, is your palm more square or is it more oblong, rectangular? Do you have short fingers or do you have long fingers? In truth, many people have kind of medium fingers and kind of a mix between square and oblong. But as we're doing palmistry, you will find a lot of it is about binaries, polarities, just so that we can sort of know which direction something is leaning. How do you read? Most of the time, this can be judged by just sort of looking at the shape of a fully outstretched hand. But sometimes a ruler can be helpful. And you can sort of see, if you're kind of in between square and oblong, you can literally measure it and see what fits more for that. Oblong hands are generally noticeably more oblong than square. You'll kind of get an impression of it over time. So square palms are said to belong to people who are more active, who are more practical, logical, and who have a lot of strength and stamina. People who are should try out for athletics or do things like that. People with oblong palms are generally more intuitive. They have a lot of ideas, might be more thoughtful, and they need a lot of variety in their life. I have found from reading palms that a lot of women have oblong palms and a lot of men have more square palms. That's just an interesting gender thing, sex thing that you'll find as you are reading palms. And later we'll talk a little bit. Oh, maybe we'll talk now. I forgot to mention something important when it comes to flexibility and texture. And I'll briefly touch on that now because you'll find that many people who are older just have more coarse texture, and they just have not very flexible hands. So are you supposed to say, oh, everyone who is older is more stubborn? Well, that may or may not be true. We're not going to get into that. But generally, as a palmist, I read more understanding their age and understanding what the palm kind of goes through over time. So I generally don't say, oh, you are more stubborn. If I know that they're older, and you just lose a lot of flexibility over time. So you want to take that into account when you're reading people's hands as well. Where are your bones? Okay. So the next thing we want to read is short versus long fingers. I didn't get a chance to talk about that yet. And the dichotomy there is impatient versus patient. And that's generally when it comes to details. So people who have shorter fingers are said to be more impatient. They like a lot of variety. They might be really good at multitasking. They're more big picture thinkers. They want to focus on like the major goals and outcomes of a project, whether that's having to do with career or life. People with long fingers are often more patient. They like detail-oriented tasks, and they enjoy the minutiae of their preferred subjects. So they might get really in-depth on like learning about a specific, let's say, comic book series and learning all of the different names and things like that. So long fingers are often classified as people who really enjoy detail. Think of like a person with really long fingers working on intricate clock, like they're building a clock or repairing a clock. With people with more short fingers are often very assertive and they want to work on those big picture things. So most of the time you can judge this by examining the length of the fingers when they're outstretched, kind of getting a good idea. But sometimes you may want to tell the participant to fold their fingers over their palm like this. And you'll have to do it because it is kind of confusing unless you show them how to fold it. And what you're measuring here is where do the fingers end up once they do that. If they're more like 7/8, it is that detailed. My book says it is. So they are 7/8 down the palm or more. They're said to be long. Those are long fingers. And so I've taken a look at my hand many times. I believe this is 7/8. So I believe I have more long fingers, even though I have very small hands. So this might be a good time to go over the elemental classifications. These are the most common classifications. I think they're pretty fun too. People generally enjoy them. I believe my palm is a water shape. And so my palm is more oblong than square. And I have longer fingers as I measured by sort of rolling them over my hand. So that's an intuitive hand type. That's someone who's more emotional, imaginative, sensitive, loyal, idealistic, possibly leaning towards introverted. And you would only really mention that if their palm were very oblong and if they had very long fingers. So I'm going to go a little bit backwards and then talk about earth, air, and fire hands. And I've got the photo over there of the elements. Yes, measuring does definitely help. So earth, you've got more square palms and shorter fingers. This is related to not only as the name element, earth, but also being down to earth, being realistic, practical, often enjoying outdoor activities, working with your hands, and often associated with people who value more traditional values and values stability and sticks to their ideals. An air palm or an air hand has a square palm as well with longer fingers. So they are needing variety. They are intellectual, full of ideas. They can be more philosophical, more practical as well, and enjoys both learning, like traditional book learning, and challenges. They enjoy some degree of competition. Generally, they're most associated with the idea of being an intellectual air hand. Fire hands have the oblong palms and the short fingers, so they might be more impatient. They're passionate, they need variety, they are energetic, they are creative, and they enjoy leading. They definitely need the variety, that's for sure. Now, I do want to go over the Diarpentigny. So yes, this is a very difficult name for me to pronounce. I apologize. This person did a lot for palmistry, and I want to go over their classifications because this is a very historic classification. So there are many different classifications according to this person. Elementary being most square, most short fingers. Very coarse skin, very hard and rough palms. And these are basically the earth classification, just dialed all the way up. But this person has a square classification as well. That's square, short fingers, coarse skin, but just not to the level of the elementary palm. Now here's where you get into kind of looking at the different things, looking at the fingers. So the spatulate hand has a more oblong palm with fingers that actually kind of flare out at the tips. And they're kind of looking like a little spatula almost. And they are said to be enthusiastic, active, and eccentric. And then you get into knotty palms, knotty hands. And we're looking at fingers again. So these have more pronounced knuckles on longer fingers. Sometimes it's called the philosophical hand as well. These people are thinkers. They enjoy alone time. They enjoy learning. That doesn't mean that they aren't good with people. They generally are. But they have an unusual sense of humor. They're very kind of solid in themselves. They're the classic armchair philosopher type. Then you have the conic hand, which is oblong palm with more rounded fingertips. And a lot of people have the conic hand. Almost sounds like iconic. But these people have a more curved hand shape, so this kind of area would be even more curved than mine right now. So I don't think I have the conic hand. This is, you would see definitely a pronounced curve here. These people are often said to be creative, idealistic, charming, cheerful, sociable, and quick thinking. I mean, it's hard not to sort of want that hand, isn't it? But so some hands just have better descriptors, I think, than others. The psychic hand. So there's actually is a psychic hand type, according to this person. Okay. That's more of an oblong palm with long and thin fingers with more pointed tips. So it's even thinner at the very top of the fingers. And you would notice that the fingers are quite long. And there are more lines on the palm than even the conic type. So these people are idealistic, sensitive, imaginative. They also can be worrywarts because there are a lot of lines, a lot of worry lines, a lot of stress lines on their palm. And they might be more spiritual or dreamy. So most people would have a mixed hand, and that's the very last type. And when we're looking at the mixed hand, then we generally go and do a more elemental classification: earth, air, fire, and water. But if you happen to see a hand and you say, oh my gosh, those finger types, like they've got kind of knotty fingers and they have very philosophical hand type, you'll probably want to mention that. But generally, the elemental classifications work for most people. They work for most situations quite well. And people get excited about it. I'm going to move on. Moving next to palmistry basics, the mounts. So now we're finally getting into reading the palm. So you have a lot of different mounts on your hands, and I'm going to go over the meanings and locations of them now. But I do want to talk about what mounts mean again. And mounts are basically indications of energy. And going over again, the higher it is, the more potential you have in a certain area, and the firmer it is, the more you're exercising that potential. So how to read the mounts? Thankfully, I found this picture. That's actually one of the ways you can read the mounts on someone's hand. You can kind of hold their hand at your eye level and see, and I bet you're all probably doing that now, and see, oh, what actually can I see rising up out of my hand? So for me, I can see a little bit for Jupiter. I can see either Apollo or Saturn mounts, and I can see a bit of Venus mount. So I've heard and I've read and I've experienced when you're looking at a quote unquote normal mount or something that isn't showing a highness, it's kind of almost level. I've heard it described as flat. I don't think that's quite it, but you'll notice when you see a mount that it's sort of rising up out of the hand, and that's how you'll be able to tell, oh, there's a little bit something there, there's potential there, there's energy. And actually in this photo here, in the PowerPoint, you can see the mounts quite clearly underneath Jupiter. And it looks like underneath Apollo finger as well. So looks like we also need a quick review of the fingers. And this is something not easily accessible information online or through buying one of these, having one of these handy. The fingers have to do, yeah, yes, it's rough, you guys, having so many puns just in your head. The index finger is Jupiter, the middle finger is Saturn, the ring finger is Sun or Apollo finger, the final finger is Mercury. And we'll be going over this when we talk about the mounts. But I wanted to mention it now because you can actually see on the photo in this PowerPoint that the mounts don't line up exactly underneath the fingers that they belong to. So you'll find it is very common that mounts are slightly displaced one way or the other. Once you really get into palmistry, you can actually read into sort of where the mount is displaced, but we're not going to have time to go over that today. We're just going to start with mounts. So, yes. So we're starting with the Venus mount. This is the mount underneath the thumb. And we've talked about this a little bit already. This is the mount that has to do with energy, passion, positivity. It has to do with sex or stamina, motivation, and affection. And you'll notice that I have a note underneath this mount and only this mount, because this mount tends to be one of the most important mounts that you can read. So if you're seeing no mount there, you could mention, or you could just sort of put that in your pocket as you're reading someone's palm, that if you don't have anything, if it's flat or if it's even sort of indented almost, A person might prefer their own company rather than being with others. They might be extremely practical. They might sort of calculate their choices. They could even have a lack of energy, because that is one of the most prominent mounts, and mounts have everything to do with energy. Okay. Then I want to talk about the Mount of Jupiter. That's under your index finger and has everything to do with Jupiter as both a planet and entity. So this has to do with leadership quality. It has to do with assertiveness, independence, but also self-esteem, ambition, and loyalty. There are a lot of associations when it comes to the mounts. So it's kind of easier to think of the planets here. We're thinking of Jupiter, the king of the gods. We're thinking of the leader. We're thinking of assertiveness. And then we're going to jump over to Saturn, which is the middle finger. This is more Saturnine. It has to do with conscientiousness, diligence, wisdom, responsibility, duty. It also has to do with mysticism. It has to do with solitary practices as well. This is a more sober finger, and you'll find that you can read different lines underneath that as well. Apollo, or the sun, generally it's called the Apollo mount though. It has to do with appreciation for beauty, having a good eye for taste, creativity, expressiveness, and even good relationships with others, like being more harmonious. Finally, on the fingers, you have the Mercury mount. And if that's high and firm, you say that people are good with communication. They might even be good with public speaking specifically because they are quick thinking, they are friendly, and generally well-liked. So now we've covered the mounts that are directly linked to the fingers and the thumb. So now we're going to jump down and go to the Mount of Luna. This is down here. This has to do with imagination, interest in travel, emotions, mysticism, and spirituality. So if you remember when we were talking about quadrants, this is in the more subconscious. This is in the more kind of passive area of the hand, the bottom area of the hand. Then we're going to go on either side of the hand, and this might be best displayed here. Yes. So you'll see the Mount of Mars here. Which one is this? This is one of the Mounts of Mars. The Mount of Outer Mars indicates someone who's able to stand up for others and sort of having determination on moral values. And I'm pretty sure that that's this one here, the outer area. The Mount of Inner Mars is about standing up for yourself. So outer Mars is standing up for others, inner is standing up for your own self. It also has to do with competitiveness. And I think this is really coming from looking at the planet again. What is Mars? Well, Mars is about competitiveness, that kind of energy, Aries type. Finally, the final mount on your hand is one that's not represented here. It's a less well-known one, and it's pretty rare if you actually find it. So it's the, well, not rare, but less common. It's the Mount of Neptune. It's the one of psychic ability, quick thinking, public speaking, and even interest in the occult. So where is that? That is here. It's in the middle of the Mount of Venus and the Mount of Luna. So if you see it, it almost looks like this whole area is kind of puffed out because that's often how it looks like. It's not usually the Mount of Neptune and then, you've got like a dip on either side. It's normally like the whole area is more, you can see that it's all kind of risen, more fleshy. even though I kind of hate that word. So now we've covered mounts, and we're finally getting into what most people think about when they think about palmistry. Oh, actually, I have an example before we move on from the mounts from one of the pictures from the Great Hall. So this is the first hand example that I'm going to bring into our lecture today. So someone sent me this hand, and as you can see, the Mount of Luna is pretty prominent. Now, it's really difficult to read mounts from a photo because you're reading it generally by looking at like this or pressing on someone's hand. So I can't actually press on this person's hand to see how firm it is, but I see that's pretty prominent. It looks like it could be higher. There's definitely something there. So I would say to this person, I have a pretty good imagination. You might have a propensity towards studying mysticism or being mystical yourself, for being creative and intuitive. Moving on finally to the major lines. So these lines on your hand, they represent the channeling of energy. If mounts represent energy, lines are the channeled. Where is this energy going? How you read lines, you sort of look at where they're going. This is where light can be a factor in how well you're able to read someone's palm. You want to read how well marked a line is, how deep they are, and whether or not there are any breakages or islands or things that we're going to talk about a bit later. But the more well marked and the more deep lines are signs that the energy is being channeled well and that the energy is stronger. The other thing you can read is placement of the lines, especially when it comes to life and destiny or the fate line. So the first line you can see, I think you'll be able to see it better here. First line on the top is the heart line. This is the first major line you'll see underneath the fingers, and it starts on the side of the pinky. So the heart line has to do with emotions, as you can imagine. And the polarity here is it more curved upwards or is it more straight? And we're looking at, if it's more curved, you might be more open emotionally. If it's more straight, you might be a little more closed off in relationships and even to do with yourself and your own inner emotions. So a curved heart line is often called a physical heart line. It's people who are comfortable with expressing emotions, people who are romantic at heart, who recover from emotional wounds more quickly and more fully. People with more straight mental lines, also called mental heart lines, might be more reserved in expressing their emotions. They might not want to burden other people with that kind of information. They are said to choose their partner while considering practical outcomes, less on more romantic ideas or just falling for someone. And they might be more high maintenance, meaning they need to hear "I love you" more often. They might even be more sensitive. So when you're reading the heart line, I would talk more about the needing to hear "I love you" more often, the sensitivity more often, than disclosing that someone is more closed off. Because I find that when you're reading palmistry, people can really take to heart your words. So you want to be careful to represent them positively and make sure that what you're saying is coming across in the best way possible, because it does seem like the curved heart line, oh, they're so romantic, they feel things so deeply, their life is and relationships are wonderful, when in fact that's not really the case. It means they could get hurt more often. It means that they just have a more romantic heart line. But you want to be careful in how you're presenting this information to people. We'll talk more about that later, though. Bye-bye. When I look at some people's palms, if you say you do palmistry, even if dropping it in a casual conversation, people will just throw their palms at you. In my experience, people love palmistry. Moving on to the headline. So this is the line having to do with thought. How do you think? And this also is curved downwards or straighter. That's the polarity there. But here we're talking about, are you more logical or are you more creative? So creative heart lines are said to be curved. People use their imagination more when they're thinking about solving a problem. People think more creatively rather than going back towards past experience when it comes to solving a problem. So one way to kind of remember, is this a creative line? Is this, or is this more logical? The creative lines are curved. So that's pointing down to the Mount of Luna. And as we know, the Mount of Luna has to do with imagination and creativity. So it's literally pointing you to what you need to remember. Straight lines, straight headlines are more practical. They're more down to earth. They think about the past when they want to solve a problem. They're remembering that versus trying to reinvent the wheel. You can also read here the length of the line. It said that length has to do with how patient people are when thinking about a problem. So someone with a shorter headline, they might be more unwilling to think about it so long that they're reconsidering different pieces. They're wanting to make decisions pretty quickly, which actually leads them to be pretty quick thinkers. But people with longer headlines don't mind thinking about a problem, perhaps too long. They might ruminate. And this kind of talks about what types of problems people like to deal with too. So that was kind of calling back to the shorter versus longer fingers. How patient are you with details? How patient are you with thinking about something for quite a long time? So you can also read other things on the headline. You can read whether or not there is a kind of a fork there. And here is the headline. It's right underneath the heart line. You can see it here. Instead of starting from the pinky finger, it's actually starting from the thumb side. And sometimes you have what's called a writer fork, where it kind of seems to break off into two different places, and it's not represented here. We're going to have an example in a moment. But headlines that break off, kind of going more straight and going more curved, are called a writer fork. Has a writer's fork because you can think both practically and creatively, which is something that you really need when you're going to write. Creativity and practicality. You can also read, is there a gap between the headline and the lifeline? Or is it kind of completely fused together? My headline and lifeline are completely fused together, which indicates a person who is more cautious. It can indicate that you have a strong sense of home and don't exactly want to travel everywhere, because the opposite of that cautious fused line is a gap between the head and the lifeline, which is indicated here. See that gap? So that's a sign of independence. It can also mean you're going to want to travel a lot. You're not going to be as pulled towards home and family. So it means you might be a little less cautious. I think that's all for the headline. I do want to circle briefly back to the heart line because I mentioned a writer's fork. So what does it mean when you have a fork on your heart line? So it doesn't mean the same thing because we're talking now about emotions again. So the fork on the heart line means that you're able to have relationships with people who have different viewpoints on life, who might come from other walks of life. And we're talking about friendships, we're talking about getting emotionally involved with people, relationships. So it's kind of a sign almost of open-mindedness when it comes to relationships. You can also read, sometimes find a trident on this line, which is just 3 lines off of the heart line, which is a sign of good fortune. If you see a line above your heart line, just kind of hanging out at the very end, that's a sign that you won't be alone later in life. You can also read where the line ends. So generally the heart line ends between the index and the middle finger. That's the most common ending place for the heart line. However, if it ends more under the Jupiter finger or the index finger, it might mean you're more idealistic. Whereas if it's ending underneath the Saturn finger, you're more practical and logical. So again, we're reading a lot of things, a lot of things in these lines. We're reading sometimes where it starts, where it ends, where it's pointing to how deep, firm it is, whether it's curved or straight. And we haven't even gotten to the 2 other lines, the lifeline and the destiny line. Okay, we had a quick question. What if a line connects the gap between head and lifeline? So that's where you're more said to be more cautious. Some writers talk about it as having like a stronger relationship with family, but I'm not seeing that in palmistry so often. I will mention, oh, this might mean this, and people will say, no, that's not my relationship with my family. So I more talk about whether or not you're cautious, because the dichotomy there is independence versus more working with others and finding a way to make yourself safe. If some things seem to be contradicting on the palm, would you more so use your intuition to determine the overall energy or the bigger picture? 2 things to say about that. Yes, you can use your intuition. However, don't discount just bringing this up with the person. I find that people often just would like to know what they mean, and they often have something to share or work through with you. However, when it comes to reading contradictory elements on the palm, some things matter more than others. The major lines matter more than the minor lines, and they matter more than most of the mounts. I say most of because the mount of Venus matters a lot too. So you do want to look at everything else in relation to these major lines. But that's the interesting thing about palmistry and determining sort of who a person is. It is as complex as we can possibly comprehend. It's literally like personality theory on your hand. There's so many different ways to understand who you are. But the value of palmistry is kind of that insight that has nothing to do with your roles in life, how you're behaving at the moment. It has nothing to do with the way that you have to act to live in your current environment. It's all about a system that was developed thousands of years ago, and it's all on your palm. It's accessible to you in that way. And I do want to mention here, although I will mention it a bit later, lines and mounts on your hand do change over time. And you're going to want to mention that to people because we don't want this to be kind of fatalistic. Palmistry is about empowerment, is about educating people on their potential. It can be a really uplifting thing. So you never want to say, this is this and it will never change, because people will always be able to change, even their line placement. So I've heard mounts change a lot. We'll talk about that too. Okay. I'm going to take a sip of my tea and then get back to the life and destiny lines. This is a lot. Hopefully you'll be able to go back and sort of review specific slides or areas because there's a lot to remember. But once you kind of understand the polarities, the open versus closed on the heart line, the logical versus creative on the headline, I find that it does help you remember how exactly you want to read these lines. Lifeline is a little bit, I find, a bit more straightforward because there isn't really a polarity there. It's literally reading the distance between the line and your thumb. So how far is it out from your thumb? The further out, the more energy you're said to have. And it's often associated with a bigger amount of Venus. So that corresponds there. But if it's hugging the thumb, if it's very faint, if it's broken, it means a little less energy. It means the person might be a bit more lethargic. Since it has to do with the amount of Venus, it has to do with passion as well and motivation. These things are tied up in each other. But it is a measure of vitality. It is not a predictor of someone's death. And you'll often have to, there are two myths that you have to usually dispel when you're doing palmistry. One has to do with this lifeline. It doesn't predict your death. It doesn't mean you're going to live very long versus very short. It really more is a measurement of energy. And then sometimes you can talk about that as a measure of health, but nothing does not show when you will die. So closer, as I've said, to the thumb, you might be more reserved, possibly introverted, possibly you haven't found the thing that you're passionate about in life, and so you're kind of less energetic. If it's further out, you're more energetic, more passionate. Maybe you found the thing that lights you up. You enjoy life and you might be more extroverted. The other things you can read, and this is where you're going to have to use your own judgment, your own intuition. Shallowness in the line or breaks in the line, islands, indicate periods of ill health. It indicates time where your energy is so low that it's actually like creating an impression on the palm, creating an impression in your life. The sister line I do like to bring up because a sister line is any line that's paralleling a major line. It could be a heart line, it could be the headline for any length of time. And it's generally a sign of fortune and support during that period. So now I want to move to the destiny line, which is often called the fate line. This has to do with purpose and path. It has to do with clear focus and where your success is coming from. It's a bit more complicated than these three other lines, and you'll find not everyone has a destiny line. Does that mean they have no destiny? No. Many successful people have no destiny or fate line. It doesn't mean that they don't have focus, doesn't mean they have no success or no hope for success. You just read it when it's present on the palm. So that's the other myth that you'll have to dispel. So you want to read the destiny line in a similar way to the lifeline. So you're looking for where it starts, and you're looking at placement specifically. You're looking if there's any breakages and sort of how deep it is on the palm. Yeah. So if the starting point of your destiny line is in the lifeline or even on the lifeline, you'll have success in a career from family help or maybe out of a family business. But unfortunately, this also sometimes is said to mean that you'll kind of feel constricted and hemmed in by family because your destiny and success is so tied up in that. There is sort of a consequence of that. Many people's destiny lines kind of just are in the middle of the palm, just a little bit outside of the lifeline. And that's kind of considered the standard placement, although it's really all over the board. So this is kind of, you don't really read where the success comes from because it's literally just kind of in the middle, either that it's taking every sort of influence, whether or not it's family, whether or not it's public, whether or not it's independent, or that it's not speaking to any of those at all. If your destiny line starts in the Mount of Luna, so it's coming up from here, this area, success will come from help of others. It's also called kind of a popularity line because you're literally bolstered by almost your clients, the people who support you. And that's more likely to happen if you are popular, which is interesting. So the destiny line is always going to point towards the Saturn finger. It's always going to come up in generally the same way, but you're reading kind of where it's starting. Many people's destiny line starts kind of up here, in the middle of the palm almost, not at the bottom. And this person's said to be more independent, having to work very hard for their success. Maybe they don't have people who really supported them from the outside and kind of had to build their own success, maybe even build their own career. The other things to read, as we mentioned, are breakages, ending placement, the length. And sometimes you can find really interesting destiny lines called like the double destiny line. You'll see that sometimes there will be a line that parallels it and then fuses. That's the double destiny line. You'll see sometimes lines are forking off and seeming to fizzle out. That generally means that you've had some sort of almost an upset, maybe a career change, maybe it's a total like life change. And then you have sort of it going off in a new direction. So I do want to bring in some examples here. What if we have two destiny lines, one center, one coming from Luna? Thank you for asking this question. They do both count. So generally when we're looking at, now I think I'm going to take in my first example here. So yes, we brought out the double destiny line. As you can see, there's the lifeline at the bottom. It's really strong. It's going all the way curved around the thumb. And that's a nice sign. I like to point that out when I see that. But you'll see two lines starting up from the base of the palm and pointing generally towards the Saturn finger. So, I mean, some palmists might say, oh, which one do I read? Because they are acting both like destiny lines. Well, they are called double destiny lines. Does it mean this person has double fate? Is it like double jeopardy? No. It means generally that people for that length of time have kind of strong fates in two areas. Either they have two careers or they have a strong career and they have something else strong, like a strong family life or a strong hobby that is speaking to their kind of fate. They're almost a legacy as a person during that time. I do want to mention that this is one of the lines, in addition with the lifeline, that has to do with timing. So the very starting point of the destiny line is sort of when you're starting to take your success in your own hands. It's your younger years, your more entrepreneurial years. And then as you go up, it's said, I think that traditionally, by the time your destiny line reaches your headline, that is age 45. Now, that might be one of those things that are changing because people are living longer and longer. And people are having important things happen to them in their career and doing different things as they sort of reach older age. However, that is the traditional read, and you're kind of reading, I guess, 55 by the time you get to Heartline. I would say that's probably going to change. And maybe modern palmists might have suggested changes to that. So we'll be on the lookout for that for modern palmist books. I wanted to bring out this hand because it's a really good example of two things. And since we're talking about destiny line, I'll mention that first. This destiny line is coming very directly from the Mount of Luna. So this person is going to find success, or maybe has already found success from the support of others. This is the one that's also called the popularity line. Something you'll be able to see as well is the lifeline is really far placed, far out from the thumb. So this indicates a very energetic person having a lot of passion in life. It's quite a fortunate sign when you see the lifeline that's kind of that far out from the thumb. I've brought another example. So it looks like you can see a pretty strong destiny line, but you can't really see its origin. It's starting in the middle of the palm. So it indicates someone who had to be really independent in making their own success. I have one final example. And I want to bring out the two other major lines that we haven't talked about in a moment, although you can see a very strong destiny line here. The headline and the heartline are very curved. I would say this is more curved than most. So I would say this person is very imaginative when it comes to solving problems, and they are more romantic at heart when it comes to relationships. So this is an example of curved heart and headlines. And I think I can see the beginnings or an actual writer's fork here. It is hard to tell from a photo, but it looks like there is a writer's fork example here as well. And there's a very strong destiny line, starting in the standard sort of bottom middle of the palm. Okay, we are moving on to more advanced techniques, more advanced reading in palmistry, the minor lines. And we're going to start to move a little bit faster here because there's a lot of information already. And this is something that you will really start to take in later after you've really gotten familiar with the major lines and the major mounts. But I wanted to bring this out because it's very easy to talk about these and they're pretty simple. So the first one is the Ring of Solomon. This is a literal ring underneath the Jupiter finger, and it is more curved here. It's a sign of intuition and psychic ability. It's a sign of wisdom and good judgment. It is not straight. A straight line underneath the Jupiter finger is called a sympathy line, which is very different from the Ring of Solomon. A Ring of Saturn underneath your Saturn finger, is a sign that life will be full of setbacks. You would never tell someone this, but you might say, you might acknowledge that people are having a difficult time. This might be a good opportunity for you to sort of let them tell you about things, to sort of recognize them. I have a chat here. I'm pretty sure that's, yes. Danny, if I were reading your palm, all I would say is, I understand that you might be having a difficult time with life, but then I would point out the other signs on your hands, showing your strength, your ingenuity, your potential, and your talents. So that's a good example of how to sort of handle the more negative markings on your hand, which you never want to focus on. There is something called a girdle of Venus, and this is looking like this. And it sort of looks like a curved line that is basically just hugging the tops of your fingers. This is also a sign of sensitivity. It's a sign of, I kind of think of it as a sign of a highly sensitive person line. Some people have a hepatica or a health line. This is a line that's sort of starting near the bottom of your palm and going up to the Mercury finger. This line should be clear and well marked. It's just a sign that you're taking care of yourself physically. If you don't have it, it doesn't mean that you're unhealthy. We only read the lines that we see rather than reading what we don't see. So it's a sign of health. There's also another a line that goes up called the sun line. And oh, actually, it's here. You can actually read it on this. The sun line goes to the sun finger. This is a fun line. It's a line of confidence. It's a sign of creative ability, success, and it's going towards that Apollo finger or sun finger there as well. A lot of people come to Palmas having, had a reading a while ago, and they ask about what they call marriage lines. And more modern palmists, such as Richard Webster, likes to call that relationship lines rather than marriage lines, because it's not actually about marriage. It's about any strong relationship in your life. It doesn't have to be romantic. And it's an indication of your potential relationships. So it is a horizontal. They're horizontal markings that are coming off the side of your palm on your little finger side. And you're going to read how many there are and where they're starting. So if they are very strong relationships in your life, they are going to start well on the side of your palm. And if they're kind of less strong, but still strong enough to show up on this area, there's still a strong relationship potential there, but you're reading the amount, so how many. The other thing you'll read how many underneath this little finger here is children lines. So that's the potential of how many children could you have if you wanted to have kids. Interestingly, these are the vertical lines underneath your little finger. It means something different for men. It may not indicate biological children at all. It just indicates children they are close to. They may or may not be their biological children. So that's another myth you'll have to dispel. Relationship lines are not necessarily your marriages. They are strong relationships. Children lines are your potential to have kids, not necessarily, oh, you're going to have, 9 kids in your life. Thank goodness. We do not have to handle that anymore as women, as people who bear children. Okay, I have some more examples here from our group. So here's an example of a possible girdle of Venus. It's very faint, and you'll see that these minor lines, they are going to be a bit more faint. They might be kind of broken up, but you can kind of see here. There's a curvature here. It's looking like a faint girdle of Venus. It's not quite close enough to be a sister line. So I'm thinking it's that sign of intuition. It's a sign of a highly sensitive person too. Here is another example of a hepatica line. So this is a bit faint. It's a bit curved, but it's still there. So it's a sign that this person's taking care of their physical health. It is pointing towards that little finger there, right here. So that indicates that this is a hepatica line. Okay, now we have markings on the hands, or marks on the hands. So you will find this on every line. You will find this on every major line. You will find these on minor lines. You'll find these squares. You'll find crosses, triangles, stars. They're all over your hands. If you're more like intuitive hand type, you'll often find these tiny little markings. So here is what these all mean. I'm going to go over these pretty quickly because this is more something you can reference, can look back up. There are protective squares. Those are squares on your hands that encloses a break. It's generally a fortunate sign that shows persistence in dealing with hardship. And these are literally, you'll see them, they're squares. And if they are protective, they are on the outside of, let's say, a breakage in one of your lines. If they're more restrictive square, they don't enclose a break, and they are a sign of holding someone back in that specific area. There are some exceptions to this rule, one of them being the teacher's square. You'll see that on underneath the Jupiter finger, and it's a square that one of the lines touches the lifeline. And this is said to be a square that means someone is good at conveying information and would be good in a teacher capacity. There are such things as islands, which means there's a period of difficulty or emotional turmoil. You'll often see this on the heartline. You'll often see this on the lifeline as well. There are chains, which are the series of islands showing the longer periods of difficulty in that area, whether it be relationships, energy levels. There are crosses, and we'll talk a bit later about mystic cross. Crosses mean a sign of change. It's often a sign of warning when it's on a minor line. Crossing a minor line, there are some exceptions, including the St. Andrew's cross, which we don't have time to get into, but know that it exists and it's cool. The triangle is a fortunate sign of good potential in whatever area it's landing. So whether it's under the Apollo finger, it's on the Apollo mount, that would be a sign of great potential in, let's say, the arts or working in that sort of industry of recognizing good taste. Forked lines are generally positive. We've talked about forks on the heart line and head line. Wavy lines are times of uncertainty. You can think of wavering. Sister lines increases the power of the adjacent line. We talked about that with heart line and the lifeline. Tasseled lines are kind of breaking off fragments. Lines indicating nervousness or even weakness there. You'll often find tassel lines going either up or down. So ascending lines mean that energy is ascending, going up. Descending lines means that the energy is kind of going out. Descending, there's kind of a loss there. Finally, I will go over stars. It's generally a positive sign. Stars they look like little stars. They're 4 or 5 little lines that make kind of one of those stars that you draw on your pieces of paper, and they're generally positive. I have one example here of one other line that I didn't get to speak to. It's a Via Lasciva line, which is a sign that you need a lot of excitement and energy of life. It's very small. I think I saw it in one of the other palms that was posted, but it's a straight horizontal line, kind of at the, I guess, a 3/4 mark down this pinky side of the palm. It's just a sign that you need very excitement in your life. And then I think I see a teacher square here. You see this square here? And it's extending down. There's actually another one here. It's extending down to touch the lifeline. So this means that there's a presence of a teacher square, someone who's able to convey difficult concepts in a way that's understandable to people. Now there's a lot of good light on this hand. So I see some stars here, positive sign. I see a cross here. I see the mystic cross here, and there are often many. And the mystic cross is always between the head and the heart lines. And then I'm seeing some children lines here. I can't quite see it far enough to look at the relationship lines, but there are a lot of lines on people's hands. And you're going to need some good light in order to read them. So finally, we're getting to the very last thing, going to touch on this very little. We want to talk about the quadrangle, which is the area between the heart and the headlines. So the wider it's said that the area between these two are, it's said that this person is more generous. They're more flexible in ideas, they're more sociable, and they're more confident. The narrower, the less so. However, if it's more narrow on the thumb side, a person is more well-liked or just. Whereas if it's more narrow on the little finger side, there is a difficulty in expressing the self. I'm going to bring out the example right now because you can see there's a narrowness here in the sort of thumb side with the heart line here. So that means this person is well-liked and just. And you can see there's a greater opening here. So it's more narrow here. And this is the quadrangle area. Also want to bring to attention the mystic cross area, which is also in the quadrangle. I'm not sure. I see some faint mixed mystic crosses here. And that is a sign of psychic ability or interest in the mystical or the occult. Fingerprints, I just want to give you the very basic guidance. A loop is the most common fingerprint. It's indication of someone who's versatile and flexible. A whorl is someone who's more independent and hardworking, and this is kind of like a circle whorl. And an arch is kind of arching up like that, is more down to earth and loyal. That we will get into fingerprints if we do a part 2 of palmistry because there's too much here. Okay, I've told you everything I know about basics. I've probably gone too far in advanced, but I can't help it. So now we're finally getting to just the basic guidelines of reading. We talked about it a little bit already, but I want to give you my best tips for a really good reading. One of them is very practical. Just find the right light. A lot of times, people don't really know what's required for palmistry, and they'll put you kind of almost in a dark corner, and that's not going to work. You're going to need light, and if you're going to see those minor lines, if you're going to look at anything like fingerprints, you're going to need a lot of light. And you want to be able to bring that or find somewhere that you're going to have enough light to read well. Also, always ask first before you are going to touch someone's hands, before you're going to even nowadays, before you're going to get close to someone in order to do that. Because you never know. Take your time with people. Sometimes it's hard to tell, is this a square palm? Is this an oblong palm? You might want to move someone's hand around, and you can even tell them, oh, you know what? I'm kind of in between these. And then they might share, oh, you know what? This is more resonating with me. So I think it is going to be more of an air hand versus a water hand or something like that. So take your time, talk with people. Be really careful about what you say and how you say it, because readers, palmists, tarot readers, mediums, they actually have a lot more power than they give themselves credit when it comes to readings. People will take what you say and really take it to heart a lot of times. So you're going to want to be even more careful than you would just trying to have a conversation with someone. You want to be really, really careful about what you say, because you don't know what people are going to really hold on to. I've had I've had people come to me and tell me what other palmists have said decades ago. And maybe it was something that was kind of off-putting or frightening to them. But they generally hold on to the negative stuff a bit more than you'd like them to. So be really careful about what you present. If you're seeing a lot of negative lines, a lot of sensitivity, be so careful. Focus on the good things. Focus on where their energy and passions lie, or potentials lie. You know that. When you're reading, it can be a conversation with someone. Allow them to tell you when you're wrong or when they think you're wrong. Allow them to tell you that that isn't quite fitting for them. And you can just say, well, this is just what it means from the perspective of palmistry. And just kind of plant that seed of, sometimes you're planting the seed of doubt in sort of people's own limitations of themselves. You're kind of going to challenge that. Or we're just going to sort of move past that. Sometimes when you are acknowledging some hardships and difficulties, I think that can be a really powerful thing, because you can actually create a space for them to be able to talk about things that they've been struggling with in their life. And depending on your setting, how you're reading palms, how much time you have with them, you might actually be able to serve them well just by acknowledging certain things in their life that they're struggling with. And that can be a really important and powerful tool when it comes to doing palmistry reading. Richard Webster says, palmistry is a conversation between two people. In an ideal reading, the client would discuss whatever's bothering them, and the palmist could give special insight and advice based on what they're reading in the palm, whether that be the destiny line, whether that be the potential, the talents they have, or you're just there to sort of listen and let them know this is temporary. This is solvable. These are the things we can focus on. So there are a lot of opportunities in palmistry, specifically as a form of readings, even as a form of divination, to do a lot of good. And you're wanting to take advantage of that. I'm going to read. Oh, nice. Nice. I'll see you guys in the Great Hall. Those who weren't able to stay, we're almost finished up though. I'm just going to do a quick review of our procedure because we've gone through a lot. So when you first start to read for people, just let them know what's going to happen. Let them know that you're going to be looking at your palm, that you're going to look at their palms. And this is a system that's thousands of years old, and that lines and mounds on your hand will and do change over time. So let them know that none of this is set in stone and they're still totally able to shape their destinies. So you can examine both of their hands for the first look indicators, that's the texture, consistency, things like that. You're going to determine hand shape, whether it be the elemental classifications or the other classifications. You're going to read the mounts and the 4 major lines. You can do either one first. And you're finally going to be able to look at the minor lines and other markings, finger sets, fingerprints, all these other things if you have time. But you're always going to want to have your closing remarks, just letting them know that they can shape and change anything they want. You can restate major findings and ask for any questions. A lot of times people will have questions. A lot of times people will want to know how to contact you in the future if they end up wanting to ask you about something later. So make sure to give time for them to be able to get that contact information and to clarify anything. You don't want them to walk away with anything bothering them. And these are some good resources. The 2 modern ones that I think, honestly, I think these are enough, unless you're going to be like a full-time palmist. But Richard Webster is a great author. He writes about palmistry in a really, really understandable and empowering and useful way. Historical resources, D. Arpentini, yes, that person, and these other guys. They are all people who sort of have built modern palmistry by writing about it. And finally, I just want to thank everyone who's come to this lecture, who's watching the replay. I hope this has been really useful and helpful and exciting to everyone. And I want to thank everyone who provided pictures of their palms for me to use as an example. One of the things about palmistry is you can read about it, but the best thing is to see as many palms as you possibly can. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and this has been Palmistry 101. I'm going to stop